The mountain peak was silent except for the wind that howled through jagged rocks. In a shallow cave, barely large enough to shelter a grown man, a tiny dragon hatchling trembled against the cold stone. Annie was her name, not that anyone had bothered to ask. Her scales, which should have shimmered like moonlight, were dull and gray from neglect. Her eyes, clouded and sightless since birth, had never seen the world she'd been abandoned in. The other dragons had left 3 days ago. Annie had heard their mighty wings beating against the air, felt the rush of wind as they took flight, one by one. Her mother's scent had lingered the longest, but even that had faded now. In dragon culture, weakness was not tolerated. A blind hatchling could not hunt, could not fly with precision, could not contribute to the flight. She was a burden, and burdens were left behind. Annie pressed herself deeper into the cave, her small body racked with hunger. She opened her mouth and let out a pitiful cry, not the roar of a mighty dragon, but the mewling of an abandoned child. Tears leaked from her useless eyes, freezing on her scales in the mountain cold. She had no concept of hope anymore, only the gnawing certainty that she would die here. Alone and forgotten. That's when she heard footsteps. They were careful, measured steps crunching against snow and gravel. Annie's head lifted, her nostrils flaring. The scent was unfamiliar, not dragon, not the mountain goats she sometimes smelled in the distance. This was something else entirely. Something warm, something that carried the smell of wood smoke and strange fabrics. Holy hell. A male voice breathed. "You're just a baby." Massey couldn't believe what he was seeing. He'd been tracking the dragon flight for weeks, hoping to document their migration patterns for the Scholars Guild. Instead, he'd found this a hatchling no bigger than a large dog, shivering and alone. Her eyes were wrong, he noticed immediately. Clouded, unfocused, blind. "They left you," he whispered, and anger flared in his chest. He'd studied dragons for years, knew their ways, but seeing their cruelty firsthand was different. "They actually left you to die," Annie hissed weakly, trying to sound threatening. Her body tensed, ready to strike if this stranger came closer. She didn't know what a human was, only that she was vulnerable and alone. Massey slowly lowered himself to sit on the cave floor, keeping his distance. "Easy there, little one. I'm not going to hurt you." He reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of dried meat from his rations. The smell made Annie's head turn sharply in his direction, her nose twitching. She was starving. The scent of food overwhelmed her caution. Annie crawled forward on unsteady legs, her claws scraping against stone. When she reached Massey, she hesitated, releasing a small whimper that broke his heart. "Here," he said softly, placing the meat directly in front of her. "It's okay." Annie's jaws closed around the offering, tearing into it desperately. It was the first food she'd had in days, and she ate with the frantic energy of the dying. Massey watched, his throat tight with emotion. When she finished, she moved closer to him, drawn by his warmth. "You're coming with me," Massey decided, reaching out his hand slowly. "I don't care what dragon law says. No creature deserves this." Annie felt the hand touch her head gently, fingers scratching behind the ridges of her small horns. The touch was foreign but not unpleasant. For the first time since her mother had left, she felt something other than fear and abandonment. She felt safe. Massey carefully wrapped Annie in his thick traveling cloak and secured her against his chest. She was surprisingly light, malnourished and small for her age. As he began the long descent down the mountain, Annie pressed her face against his warmth and released a soft, rumbling sound somewhere between a purr and a sigh. The journey back to human lands took for days. During that time, Massey learned to communicate with Annie through touch and sound. She learned his footsteps, his scent, the particular rhythm of his heartbeat. She learned that his voice meant safety, that his hands brought food and comfort. In return, Massey learned that despite her blindness, Annie was remarkably aware of her surroundings. Her other senses compensated beautifully. Her hearing was exceptional, her sense of smell extraordinary. When they finally reached Massey's cottage at the forest's edge, he knew his life had changed forever. The other humans in the nearby village were terrified at first. A dragon, even a baby one, was a creature of legend and fear. But Massey stood firm. "She's blind," he explained to the village elder. "She was left to die. I won't abandon her the way her own kind did." As weeks turned to months, Annie grew stronger. Massey fashioned a special harness for her, teaching her to navigate using verbal cues and gentle guidance. She learned the layout of his cottage, the paths through his garden, the sound of the stream where they often sat together. Her scales began to shine properly silver white, beautiful in the sunlight she couldn't see. The village slowly accepted her presence. Children would come to visit, and Annie learned to be gentle, to play carefully with beings so much more fragile than herself. She became a bridge between two species that had only known conflict. One evening, as Massey sat reading by the fire with Annie's head resting in his lap, he stroked her scales thoughtfully. "You know," he said quietly, "your family thought you were worthless because you couldn't see. But you've taught an entire village that strength isn't about perfect eyes or powerful wings. It's about heart." Annie rumbled contentedly, her tail curling around his chair. She couldn't see Massey's face, couldn't see the tears in his eyes or the smile on his lips, but she could feel his love, his acceptance, his unwavering belief in her worth. She had been abandoned by dragons and saved by a human, and in that salvation, both of their worlds had grown a little bit larger, a little bit kinder. In the darkness behind her blind eyes, Annie had found something more precious than Sci-Fi had found home.